Number 17. Czech Republic, Czechia, March 12, 1999. Prague. The Czech Republic entered NATO in the first post-Cold War expansion, a former Warsaw Pact state joining the alliance it had been told was the enemy for 40 years. In 1968, Soviet tanks rolled into Czechoslovakia to crush the Prague Spring. That memory burned itself into national identity. When communism fell in 1989, and the country split peacefully into Czech Republic and Slovakia in 1993, the Czechs knew exactly what they wanted: a permanent guarantee that Soviet-style fraternal assistance would never return. NATO membership was not abstract geopolitics. It was a shield against déjà vu. Czechia restructured its armed forces, cut bloated conscript units, and built a smaller professional military tailored to NATO standards. It joined Partnership for Peace, reformed defense laws, and turned old Warsaw Pact doctrine into Western-style interoperability. Czech troops deployed alongside other NATO forces in the Balkans and later in Afghanistan, proving they weren't just passive beneficiaries, but active contributors. For a country that had been occupied for most of the 20th century, having a say in alliance decisions was a quiet revolution. But once the immediate memory of Soviet occupation faded and a new generation grew up with NATO as a given, enthusiasm dulled. Defense budgets shrank below promised levels. Politicians discovered NATO was easy to support rhetorically while quietly underfunding the military. For many young Czechs, Russia was a distant story, not a direct threat. Czechia stayed firmly pro-NATO, but it slipped into the same pattern as many Western allies, treating the alliance as cheap insurance rather than a bill that must be paid. Still, compared to its neighbor Poland, Czech caution looked almost restrained. Number 18. Poland, March 12, 1999, Warsaw. Poland's road to NATO ran through uprisings, partitions, and betrayals by every great power in Europe. Invaded by Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union in 1939, abandoned at Yalta, crushed again under martial law in the 1980s, Poland learned the hardest lesson of all. When you're between Germany and Russia, you cannot survive alone. When communism collapsed, Polish elites had a single strategic objective: join NATO as fast as possible, no matter the cost. So Poland treated NATO membership like a national project. It reformed its military, opened its archives, purged communist-era officers, and aligned its doctrine with Western standards. Joining in 1999 was just step one. Over the next 2 decades, Poland became one of the few European states to consistently take NATO's 2% defense target seriously and then blow past it. By the mid-2000s, Polish troops were in Iraq and Afghanistan. By the 2020s, Poland was planning for 4+% of GDP on defense and shopping for top-tier American and Korean hardware. Warsaw didn't just want protection, it wanted to be a frontline power. The downside was psychological as much as fiscal. Poland's entire strategic culture is built around worst-case scenarios: another partition, another betrayal, or another invasion from the east. That fear drives massive spending, but it also fuels constant friction with Western Europe. Polish leaders look at German hesitation and French ambiguity and see people who don't take Russia seriously. Meanwhile, some Western capitals see Poland as alarmist, almost eager to frame everything as an existential showdown. Poland is NATO's zealot, the ally that will always show up, always spend, and never forgive anyone who hesitates. For better or worse, that makes Poland the conscience of the alliance's eastern flank and the permanent irritant of its complacent west. Number 19. Hungary, March 12, 1999, Budapest. Hungary's relationship with Russia carries its own scars. In 1956, Hungarian revolutionaries rose up against Soviet domination, one only to be crushed by tanks and mass arrests while the West watched and did nothing. When Hungary finally escaped Moscow's orbit in 1989, joining NATO felt like correcting history. Never again would Hungary stand alone against a hostile empire. Hungary reformed its armed forces, joined Western institutions, and initially presented itself as a reliable Atlantic-minded partner. It sent troops to NATO missions, adopted new equipment, and seemed to fit well into the first wave of post-communist members. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, Hungary was often discussed in the same breath as Poland and Czechia, a success story of post-Soviet integration. Then domestic politics shifted. Under Viktor Orban, Hungary drifted toward illiberal democracy, clashing with the European Union on rule of law and simultaneously cultivating warmer ties with Moscow and Beijing. While Hungary remained in NATO formally, it began dragging its feet on key decisions, especially anything involving Ukraine or criticism of Russia. Budapest discovered it could wield the alliance's consensus rule as leverage, blocking communiques, delaying decisions, and trading its signature for side deals. Hungary's military contribution never matched its political weight. A modest force and limited spending combined with an increasingly transactional attitude toward the West. Where Poland sees NATO as a lifeline, Hungary sees it as a bargaining chip. And that divergence inside the same expansion wave hinted at a deeper pattern. Not every post-communist state would become the Eastern version of Germany. Some would discover they could sit inside NATO while flirting with its rivals. Number 20, Bulgaria. March 29, 2004, Sofia. Bulgaria, once one of the Soviet Union's most loyal satellites, pivoted sharply after 1989. For decades, it had been a near-automatic rubber stamp for Moscow, even jokingly called the USSR's 16th Republic. But when the Eastern Bloc collapsed, Bulgaria faced a choice: cling to Russian patronage and isolation, or turn west toward the European Union and NATO. Geographically perched on the Black Sea, its ports and airspace suddenly mattered a great deal to an alliance worried about Russia's southern fleet. Joining NATO in 2004 required Bulgaria to overhaul a rusted military and a corrupted procurement system. It retired vast stockpiles of Soviet-era equipment, trimmed bloated conscript forces, and began integrating with Western structures. Bulgarian troops deployed to Afghanistan and Kosovo, building a modest but real contribution to alliance operations. Its territory became valuable for logistics, exercises, and as a potential staging area in a Black Sea crisis. Yet Bulgaria never fully escaped the gravitational pull of Russian energy and influence. Gas pipelines, nuclear projects, and entrenched oligarchic networks kept Moscow's leverage alive. Defense budgets stayed low. Political instability made long-term planning difficult. On paper, Bulgaria is a NATO frontline state on the Black Sea. In practice, it has often looked more like a vulnerable bridge, partly secured, partly exposed, always at risk of being pulled two ways. Bulgaria's membership underscores a central paradox of NATO enlargement. You can bring countries into the alliance faster than you can transform their political economies. Number 21, Romania, March 29, 2004, Bucharest. Romania shares something with Poland, a deep historical fear of Russia and painful experience under Soviet domination. After World War II, Romania lost territory, sovereignty, and freedom, emerging as one of the more repressive communist regimes in Eastern Europe. When the regime fell violently in 1989, the foreign policy priority was clear: escape Moscow's shadow permanently. NATO and EU membership became twin obsessions. Romania cleaned up some corruption, reformed its armed forces, and opened itself to Western advisors and trainers. Joining NATO in 2004 was as much a psychological break with the past as a military step. Romania offered something the alliance urgently needed: Black Sea coastline facing Russia, plus proximity to the Balkans and the eastern flank. Over time, Romania quietly became one of NATO's more serious eastern members. It allowed U.S. forces to rotate through bases, hosted missile defense facilities, and increased defense spending even when its economy struggled. Romanian pilots joined Baltic air policing. Romanian troops fought in Afghanistan and Iraq. While not as loud as Poland, Romania acted on the same fear. If there is a war, better to have Americans already in your country than waiting over the horizon. Still, Romania wrestles with chronic corruption, uneven modernization, and a limited industrial base. It is a frontline state that knows exactly what it is afraid of, but not always how to build all the tools it needs. In many ways, Romania is a story in progress, committed, exposed, and hoping the rest of NATO understands how fragile the Black Sea balance really is. Number 22, Slovenia, March 29, 2004. Ljubljana. Slovenia is the quiet overachiever of the former Yugoslav republics. It escaped the worst of the Yugoslav wars with a brief 10-day conflict in 1991, then sprinted toward Western integration while its neighbors burned. Small, relatively affluent, and politically stable, Slovenia treated NATO and EU membership as markers of returning to Europe, not just security guarantees. By the time Slovenia joined NATO in 2004, its military was modest but professional. It quickly plugged into alliance missions, sending troops to the Balkans and Afghanistan. Slovenia's geography, between Italy, Austria, Hungary, and Croatia, made it more of a logistical link than a frontline state. But that was fine. Its real value lay in being a low-maintenance, reliable ally from a region better known for crises. The limitation was simple: scale. Slovenia's size capped its military contributions, and domestic politics never prioritized defense spending. It met some NATO benchmarks intermittently, but never became a heavyweight in planning or operations. Instead, it offered something else: a proof of concept that some parts of ex-Yugoslavia could integrate smoothly. In a region associated with ethnic wars and state collapse, Slovenia's uneventful NATO story is itself a kind of quiet success. The alliance needs those just as much as dramatic conversions. Number 23, Slovakia, March 29, 2004, Bratislava. Slovakia's path to NATO was tied to its bigger neighbor. When Czechoslovakia split peacefully in 1993, most outsiders assumed Czechia would move faster toward Western integration. For a while, Slovakia lagged behind, slowed by nationalist politics and uneven reforms. But geopolitical gravity pulled both halves of the old state toward the same destination. By the early 2000s, Slovakia had stabilized enough to qualify. Joining NATO and the EU nearly simultaneously allowed Bratislava to anchor itself firmly in Western structures. Slovakia reformed its conscript-based army into a smaller professional force, realigned doctrine, and contributed troops to alliance missions in Afghanistan and the Balkans. Its geography, bridging Central Europe and the East, made it a useful transit and reinforcement corridor. The challenges have been familiar: limited budgets, political fluctuations, and occasional flirtations with populist or Russia-friendly rhetoric. Yet in practice, Slovakia has remained inside the consensus most of the time. Its forces, though small, are interoperable. Its territory is part of NATO's reinforcement routes to the east. It is not the star of any strategy document, but without such mid-sized connectors, NATO's eastern posture would be far harder to sustain. Slovakia sits in the middle of Europe and in the middle of many debates. Its significance lies less in its own power than in what can move through it when things go wrong. And number 24, Estonia, March 29, 2004, Tallinn. Estonia is proof that size and history do not dictate strategy forever. Annexed by the Soviet Union in 1940, occupied for 50 years, and flooded with Russian-speaking settlers, Estonia could easily have remained in Moscow's orbit. Instead, after regaining independence in 1991, it sprinted west. The goal was blunt: lock in sovereignty before Russia changed its mind. Joining NATO in 2004 was the heart of that plan. Estonia overhauled its conscript system, built a lean, high-tech military, and embraced cyber defense as a core mission. When massive cyber attacks hit Estonia in 2007, after a dispute with Russia over a Soviet-era statue, Tallinn treated it as a dress rehearsal for hybrid war. NATO, slowly, EU began to see Estonia as a laboratory for 21st century threats. But geography is merciless. Estonia shares a direct land border with Russia and lies just a short hop from St. Petersburg. Its territory is flat, easily overrun, and difficult to defend without rapid reinforcement. That makes it both a symbol and a test. If Article 5 means anything, it has to mean defending places like Estonia in the opening days of a crisis. Estonia's bet is stark. It has done everything by the NATO book: reformed, spent, contributed to missions far from home. In exchange, it expects that, if the worst happens, American, British, Polish, and other troops will fight and die on Estonian soil. The question is no longer whether Estonia is committed to NATO. It is whether NATO is fully committed to Estonia. Number 25, Latvia, March 29, to 2004, Riga. Latvia's story parallels Estonia's but carries its own tensions. Also annexed by the USSR in 1940, also subjected to massive demographic manipulation, Latvia emerged in 1991 with a large Russian-speaking minority and a fragile sense of national security. Like Estonia and Lithuania, it treated NATO membership as non-negotiable survival policy. Latvia's small military focused on niche capabilities and integration rather than mass. It hosted NATO exercises, agreed to rotational deployments of alliance troops, and contributed forces to missions abroad, not because it had excess capacity, but to prove it deserved Article 5 as much as older members. Riga became a regular host for alliance meetings and public messaging about the eastern flank. The vulnerability is twofold. Militarily, Latvia sits exposed, with limited depth and few natural defensive lines. Politically, its Russian-speaking population creates opportunities for disinformation, agitation, and claims of protecting compatriots, the same script Moscow has used elsewhere. NATO planners worry not just about tanks crossing borders, but about hybrid incidents that test unity in more ambiguous ways. Latvia lives with a permanent contradiction. It is both fully inside NATO and perpetually at risk of being treated as expendable by those far from its borders. Its leaders spend much of their time reminding wealthier, safer allies that the alliance's credibility doesn't live in conference rooms. It lives or dies on frontiers like theirs. Number 26, Lithuania, March 29, 2004, Vilnius. Lithuania's relationship with Russia is the most openly confrontational of the Baltic trio. Once part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, then carved up between empires, then annexed by the USSR, Lithuania carries a long memory of being squeezed. Independence in 1991 did not erase that. It sharpened it. Like Estonia and Latvia, Lithuania pursued NATO membership with urgency. It restructured its armed forces, opened its territory for training and rotations, and sent troops to Afghanistan and Iraq. But Lithuania added something else. A political voice unafraid to call Russia what it saw, an imperial revisionist power. Vilnius became one of the loudest advocates for supporting Ukraine and for sanctioning Moscow after each act of aggression. Lithuania's geography amplifies its importance and its danger. And it sits at one end of the Suwałki Gap, the narrow corridor connecting Poland to the Baltics, squeezed between Belarus and Russia's Kaliningrad exclave. Every war game about a Russian move on the Baltics features Suwałki as the first crisis point. If that corridor is cut, Lithuania and its neighbors are effectively isolated from the rest of NATO by land. Lithuania behaves like a country that understands this perfectly. It invests in territorial defense, hosts allied forces, and makes itself as hard a target as its size allows. In return, it demands clarity from the alliance. For Vilnius, ambiguity is not a strategy. It's the prelude to abandonment. Number 27, Slovenia, already covered above. Number 28, Slovakia, already covered above. Number 29, Croatia, April 1st, 2009, Zagreb. Croatia fought its way into existence in the bloody wars of Yugoslav dissolution. In the early 1990s, it was on the receiving end of artillery, ethnic cleansing, and great power hesitation. By the late 2000s, that Croatia, once sanctioned, criticized, and scrutinized, was being invited into NATO. The symbolism was enormous, a former conflict zone turned alliance partner. Before accession, Croatia had already cooperated with NATO in Bosnia and elsewhere. Joining required further professionalization of its armed forces, aligning standards, and dealing with war crimes' legacies. Zagreb reformed enough to satisfy a skeptical West and walked through the door alongside Albania in 2009. For NATO, this was about locking in stability on the Adriatic and making sure the Balkans did not produce another surprise war. Croatia brings a capable but small military, valuable ports, and hard-earned experience in modern conflict. It has contributed to NATO missions, including in Afghanistan, and positions itself as a regional player with credibility in the Balkans. But it also carries nationalist politics that periodically flare up, especially in relation to Bosnia and Serbia. Those tensions haven't derailed its alliance role, but they remind planners that Balkan politics never fully disappear. They just quiet down between crises. Croatia's membership is both a success story and a warning. Integrating former warring states into NATO can stabilize the map, but it also brings unresolved resentments inside the tent. Number 30, Albania, April 1st, 2009, Tirana. Albania spent the Cold War under one of Europe's most paranoid dictatorships, isolated even from other communist states. When that regime collapsed, the country had almost no functioning institutions, a shattered economy, and a security sector riddled with corruption and old loyalties. The idea that Albania would one day sit at the same NATO table as the United States and United Kingdom would have sounded like fantasy in 1990. Yet by 2009, it happened. Albania worked through Partnership for Peace, reformed its armed forces, and aligned itself firmly with the West. NATO, in turn, saw value in bringing in a state that could either become a long-term source of instability or a reliable ally in a fragile region. Membership was a bet that anchoring Albania would make the entire Adriatic safer. Albania's military remains small and limited, but it has contributed troops to Afghanistan in peacekeeping missions. Its greatest offering is political, a Muslim-majority country that chose NATO and the EU path, undermining simple civilizational narratives about alliance lines. Domestically, corruption and weak governance persist, and defense capacity is modest. But Albania's external alignment is clear. For NATO, Albania is another reminder that security is not just about tanks and jets. Sometimes it is about choosing which way a country looks when it wakes up in the morning. Tirana chose Brussels and Washington. Number 31, Montenegro, June 5, 2017, Podgorica. Montenegro is NATO's smallest mainland member, with a population that would barely fill a medium-sized European city. Yet its accession triggered furious reactions from Russia and noisy debates inside the alliance. Why bring in another tiny state with limited military capacity? The answer lay in geography and symbolism. Montenegro sits on the Adriatic coast, controlling valuable shoreline and potential naval facilities. More importantly, it was the subject of an alleged coup attempt in 2016, with Montenegrin authorities accusing Russian operatives and local proxies of trying to topple the government to stop NATO membership. Whether every detail of that plot was exactly as portrayed, one fact was clear: Moscow cared enough to interfere. For NATO, admitting Montenegro became a test of resolve. If external pressure could veto membership, the enlargement door was effectively closed. Montenegro's tiny armed forces were almost irrelevant. Its flag in the North Atlantic Council was the point. After joining, Montenegro contributed small contingents to alliance missions and aligned its security policy with NATO norms. Domestic politics remained fragile, and Russian influence did not vanish overnight. But from the alliance's perspective, the risk of leaving Montenegro exposed was greater than the burden of bringing it in. A small country thus became a large precedent. Number 32, North Macedonia, March 27, 2020, Skopje. North Macedonia's path to NATO membership is the purest example of how alliance enlargement can be held hostage by bilateral disputes. The country had been ready in NATO's eyes for years. It had reformed its forces, participated in missions, and signaled unwavering desire to join. The obstacle was a single word: its name. Greece, already a member, objected to its neighbor calling itself Republic of Macedonia, claiming historical and territorial implications. For over a decade, Athens used its veto to block NATO accession, regardless of Skopje's performance on reforms. The message was brutal: doing your homework isn't enough if one ally decides to make you an example. The stalemate broke with the Prespa Agreement in 2018. Skopje agreed to rename the country Republic of North Macedonia. In return, Greece dropped its veto. Within less than 2 years, North Macedonia joined NATO. Its tiny military was already interoperable. Its political sacrifice was enormous. North Macedonia's flag in NATO headquarters represents both the power and the danger of the alliance's consensus rule. Existing members can extract painful concessions on issues only loosely related to security. Aspirant members can be left in the waiting room indefinitely, regardless of performance. It worked in this case, but at the cost of teaching everyone how much leverage a single capital can wield. That lesson would resonate loudly when the next two applicants came knocking, Finland and Sweden, triggered not by old disputes, but by a new war.